The decision to exile Earth passed. Then, humanity made its rules clear. The chamber had already made its decision. Before I opened my mouth, I could tell. By the way, the arbiter of the galactic conclave sat with his 4 hands folded on the speaking podium, the way his wide, pale eyes did not meet mine. Way the 412 delegate pods arranged in their vast semicircle had gone utterly still, the kind of stillness is not natural in a room full of 412 alien species. It is the stillness of something already finished. Stillness of people waiting for a formality to catch up with a conclusion they reached long ago. My name is Yara. I am 41 years old. I was born in Akron on a Tuesday morning when the power cut out during a rainstorm. And my mother always said that was why I grew up comfortable with darkness. I have been Earth's sole permanent ambassador to the Galactic Conclave for 6 years. I have sat in this chamber through budget disputes, territorial hearings, resource allocation arguments that lasted 9 of our months, and 2 diplomatic crises that nearly cracked the conclave's outer membership in half. I have always found a way to make my voice heard in this room. Today I was not given the floor. That is not a small thing. Conclave's own founding charter, the document that the arbiter species, the Valhari, drafted 4,000 years ago, guarantees every recognized member state the right to address the chamber before any resolution affecting that member state is voted upon. I had submitted my request to speak at 600 station time. The session began at 900. My request was still marked as pending when the voting crystals began to glow. I did not stand up and shout. I did not demand the floor. I sat in my single observer's chair, not a delegate pod, because humanity had never been granted full membership, only observer status, a distinction the conclave had always found very convenient, and I watched. The voting crystals are beautiful in their way. Each delegate pod contains a pale teardrop of engineered mineral about the size of a human fist. And when a species casts its vote, it glows either gold for approval or a deep, cold blue for opposition. The chamber is designed so that every crystal is visible from every angle. Transparency. The Valhari called it when they built this place, the whole galaxy watching itself decide. The crystals began to light up gold, not one by one, in cascades, whole sections of the semicircle turning gold together. Species that had clearly coordinated beforehand, species that had made their arrangements in private rooms and quiet corridors long before this session began. The more delegation who controlled half the trade routes in the Eastern Spiral Arm, the S Collective, who had been uneasy about human expansion since we colonized the Brennan system 3 years ago. The Erics, who had never liked us to begin with and made no secret of it. The Sethari, the Delore, the Vanek. The gold, 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 gold. I counted. I always count. It is one of the things that makes me good at this job and difficult to live with. By the 402nd crystal there was still no blue. My chest felt like someone had placed something very heavy on it and walked away without explaining why. I kept my face still. I have had years of practice keeping my face still in this room. Every species in the conclave reads human expressions differently. Some find a smile threatening, some find neutral faces disrespectful, some find eye contact aggressive, and some find the lack of it suspicious. Over 6 years I had developed a face that read as nothing to everyone, a kind of diplomatic blankness that my colleague, Nathan Adler back at the Saul Diplomatic Corps, called my room temperature face. I wore it now like armor. 411, the single crystal that remained dark, belonged to the KTHVAR delegation. They were a small species avid in their body plan with iridescent feathers that shifted color with their emotional state. Their delegate, an elder female named Isari, sat with her feathers flat and gray, which in Cathar signaled something I had come to understand after 3 years of careful observation. It did not mean fear, it did not mean sadness, it meant a profound and considered refusal to celebrate. Her crystal did not glow gold, it did not glow blue either, it simply stayed dark. An abstention, 412. Votes cast, 411 in favor, 0 against. 1 abstention. The conclave had never passed a resolution with 0 opposing votes before, not in the 4,000 years of its recorded history. I knew this because I had spent the last 2 weeks reading every resolution ever passed on the theory that understanding the conclave's history was the best way to find a precedent to challenge whatever they were planning. I had found no precedent. What was happening today had never happened before. The arbiter, a Velhari elder called Sodden, ancient enough that his pale skin had gone almost translucent at the temples, rose from the speaking podium and let the hum of the chamber's translation system warm up before he spoke. His voice, when it came through the earpiece I wore, was calm and measured and carried the particular tone of someone delivering news they have already made peace with. He said that the Galactic Conclave, in its capacity as the governing body of recognized interstellar civilization, had conducted a full review of humanity's activities over the preceding 83 standard years. He said the review had found a pattern of behavior that the conclave's member species considered by substantial consensus to represent an unacceptable risk to the stability and peace of the galactic community. He listed with the careful precision of someone reading from a document the specific findings. 14 systems colonized in 80 years, a rate of expansion that exceeded any species in recorded conclave history. 2 interspecies armed conflicts resolved by human military intervention without prior conclave authorization. A weapons research program whose outputs, according to multiple intelligence assessments submitted by member species, exceeded the defensive necessity of a civilization of humanity's size. A diplomatic posture that member species described repeatedly, and informal submissions as unilateral, unpredictable and ungovernable. He said the word exile only once near the end, almost as a footnote. The resolution, he explained, quarantined Earth and all human territories from conclave trade networks, communication relay systems, and docking facilities. It would take effect in 30 galactic days, approximately 26 of our days, and would remain in effect until humanity formally petitioned for review and demonstrated to the conclave's satisfaction commitment to operating within established galactic law. He stopped speaking. The translation hum faded. Every camera in the chamber, and there were hundreds, because the conclave broadcast all its sessions to the public. Feeds of every member civilization turned toward me. I was still sitting in the observer's chair. I had not moved. I had not changed my expression. I had been counting backward from 10 in my head slowly the way my mother taught me when I was 7 years old and prone to saying things I could not take back. 10, 9, 7. I stood up. The chamber was so quiet. I could hear the soft ambient hum of the environmental system cycling air through the vents above the Mo delegation section. I picked up the small portfolio case that sat on the floor beside my chair. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I looked at Sodden for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be controlled. I said, "Noted, we will respond within 24 of your hours." Then I walked out, not quickly, not slowly, the pace of someone who has a full schedule and is already thinking about the next item on it. I did not look at the delegate pods as I passed. I did not look at the cameras. I walked the length of the chamber floor, pushed open the great curved door at the far end, and stepped into the corridor. Beyond, the door closed behind me with a sound like a held breath. Finally released, I stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds. The walls were pale gray composite, lit from above by strips of warm artificial light. There was no one else in the corridor. The conclave security staff, who normally stood at intervals along this passage, had been repositioned for the session, which meant I was alone for approximately 40 m. In either direction, I pressed my back against the wall. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth 3 times the way Nathan had taught me after the South crisis 18 months ago, when I had come very close to saying something on the public record that would have ended my career. I looked at the ceiling. Light strips hummed faintly. Then I straightened up, squared my shoulders, and opened my communications link. "Get me a secure channel to the Secretary General's office," I said to the empty air. "Tell them it passed. Tell them I'm coming home." I started walking toward the docking bay where the human shuttle waited, and I did not look back. Behind me, in the chamber I had just left, 412 civilizations were still sitting in their pods, watching the door I had walked through. I did not know it then, but several of their intelligence agencies would later report to their governments that my exit had disturbed them more than anything they had expected. They had anticipated argument. They had prepared for anger or grief or a formal protest delivered in the careful language of diplomatic procedure. They had not prepared for that walk, that pace, that forward answer, and the door swinging shut. Yari of the Kethvar, whose crystal had stayed dark, was later quoted in a private communication to her government, a communication that was not meant for human eyes but reached us anyway, through channels I will not describe. She said, "I have watched the human ambassador for 3 years. I have never seen her afraid. I did not see fear. Today either. I saw something else. I saw a person who already knows what she is going to do next. That is what concerns me, not what they will say. What they have already decided." She was right. I had known for 2 weeks, ever since the preliminary vote counts started leaking through back channels, and it became clear this was not a debate but a performance. I had spent those 2 weeks on the shuttle between Earth and the conclave station, not writing protest speeches or legal challenges. I had spent them in conversation with 7 people back home, in encrypted sessions that left no conclave accessible record, working through a document that did not yet have a name but would soon. The shuttle bay was cold and smelled of recycled air and Engine coolant, my pilot, a young man named Oliver Crane, was already running pre-flight checks when I came through the bay door. He looked up, read something in my face that my room temperature expression apparently did not fully conceal, and said nothing beyond the standard safety briefing. We lifted off from the Conclave Central Station at 11:47 hours, station time 26 days. That was how long we had before the exile took effect. The Conclave had set that window deliberately, I was certain. Long enough to seem reasonable, short enough to create pressure, designed to make humanity feel the walls closing in and reach for the obvious exit. Formal submission, a petition for review, a public acknowledgement that we had been wrong and they had been right. I looked out the shuttle's viewport as the station fell away behind us, its vast geometric bulk shrinking against the stars. I thought about my mother, who had kept the power running with candles when the lights went out, who had finished her work by flame when the grid failed her, who had once told me that the difference between people who survive hard things and people who don't is not strength or intelligence, but the simple decision made quietly and without ceremony to keep going. I pulled out my tablet and opened the document. It did not yet have a title. It had 5 clauses. I read through them one more time, changing a word here, tightening a phrase there, making it sharper and cleaner and more precise. By the time Oliver Crane set us on course for Earth, I had a title. I called it the Human Addendum, the secure channel connected at 3:12 Earth time, which meant I was looking at 200 tired faces on a grid of screens, most of them in various states of having been pulled from sleep or interrupted from whatever they had been doing when the summons went out. Heads of government, defense ministers, the senior members of the UN Security Council, the directors of the Seoul Diplomatic Corps and the Colonial Administration. Every person in this call held some piece of the machinery of human civilization in their hands. I gave them 11 minutes. I am a precise speaker. I have been trained in the kind of communication that strips everything down to what is necessary and leaves out everything that is not. I told them what had happened, the vote count, the resolution-specific language, the timeline, the practical consequences for each of our 14 colonies, the trade routes that would be affected, the communication relays that ran through conclave-controlled space and would go dark, the docking facilities that our long-haul freighters relied on that would be closed to us. I did not tell them how I felt about it. That was not what they needed from me. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 8 seconds. On a call with 200 people, 8 seconds of complete silence is remarkable. It means everyone is doing the same thing at the same time, which almost never happens unless what they have just heard has settled into all of them with the same weight. Then the UN Secretary General, a quiet and precise man named Gregory Cole, leaned slightly forward toward his camera and asked, "Ambassador O, what does the conclave believe exile means to us?" I had been waiting for that question, not that specific question exactly, but that quality of question, the one that goes underneath the event, to the assumption that produced it. They believe, I said, that our colonies on Brennan, Yashi, and the outer Delvari cluster cannot sustain themselves without conclave supply chain access. They believe our communication networks are too dependent on their relay infrastructure to function independently. At full range, they believe the psychological weight of isolation produce internal political pressure within humanity that our governments will fracture, that colonial populations will push for separate negotiations, that within one generation we will come back to them on whatever terms they set. Another silence, shorter this time than a sound that I did not expect. It started in the lower left of my screen in the feed from the Australian Federal Council chamber, where 3 of the council members appeared to be exchanging glances. One of them, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who has spent 3 decades in resource management, let out a single short breath through her nose. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound a person makes when they have been handed a problem and immediately seen something in it that the person who gave it to them did not see. That sound spread. I watched it move through the grid of faces, not loudly, not with any theatrics, just a quiet ripple of people absorbing the conclave's assumptions and finding something unexpected in them. Recognizing something, Gregory Cole looked directly at his camera and said, "They think we need them more than we need ourselves." "Yes," I said. The silver-haired woman from the Australian Council, whose name was Patricia Holden, and who I would come to know well in the months ahead, said, "Do we?" I paused for exactly the right length of time. Not as much as they think. What followed was not chaos. That is the thing people get wrong when they imagine how humanity would respond to a moment like this. They imagine rage, panic, political infighting, factions pulling in opposite directions, the messy and sometimes ugly machinery of democratic disagreement doing what it always does under pressure. And yes, some of that happened. There were heated arguments in the corners of the call. There were 3 separate shouting incidents in the first hour that had to be managed by the moderators. There were genuine disagreements about timelines and resource calculations and risk assessments that would take weeks to fully resolve. But underneath all of that, from the first hour to the last, there was something else, a kind of current running beneath the arguments, quiet and consistent and surprisingly unified. It was the current of people who had been told they could not do something and were now making an inventory of whether that was actually true. Patricia Holden put a team of 12 economists and supply chain specialists to work within the first 2 hours, running projections on conclave independent resupply routes for the outer colonies. A defense minister named Oliver Graves, who had the manner of someone who found most conversations slightly too slow for his thinking, pulled up the communication relay maps on a shared screen and started marking which nodes were conclave owned and which were not, calculating what it would take to build bridge relays across the gaps. A colonial administration director whose name was Susan Park had already been on a separate line with the Brennan Colony governor before the main call even started, because she said, quietly begun contingency planning 2 weeks ago when the preliminary vote counts leaked. I listened to all of this and felt something I had not expected to feel, a deep and specific kind of pride that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with recognition. This was my species doing what my species does, not in the dramatic ways that made the conclave nervous, not the weapons programs or the rap colonization or the unsanctioned military interventions that had ended up in the conclave's Resolution as evidence of our instability. This was the other thing. The quieter thing, the thing the conclave had apparently not included in its intelligence assessments. Humans, when they are told that a door is closed, do not stand at the door and beg. They look for the window, and if there is no window, they look at the wall. At 8:47, Gregory Cole called for a formal recess and asked me to join a private session with 12 people, the core decision-making group that would shape whatever came next. We met in a smaller call, just the 13 of us, and for the next 4 hours we talked through options with a frankness that the larger session had not permitted. I laid out 3 possible responses. The first was the one the conclave expected: a formal petition for review, an acknowledgement of the resolution, a commitment to renegotiation. This option preserved the relationship, bought time, and potentially secured readmission within 2 to 5 years. Its cost was accepting the conclave's authority to impose this resolution in the first place, which would set a precedent that could be used against us again and would signal to every other species in the galaxy that human behavior could be managed through economic and diplomatic pressure. The second option was aggressive escalation, a formal declaration that we did not recognize the resolution as legitimate, backed by a show of force at the conclave's border stations. This option was on the table because it had to be on the table, but every person in the room knew it was not what we would choose. Not because we lacked the capability. That was a debate for another day, but because it would confirm everything the conclave had said about us in their resolution. It would hand them the story they had already written. The third option was what I had been working on. For 2 weeks, I walked them through it. Carefully, not a petition, not a show force, something the conclave had no framework for, because it had never occurred to them that a species facing exile would respond by simply agreeing with the exile and then setting its own terms for what that meant. We would acknowledge the resolution. We would not challenge its legality. We would not beg for readmission. Instead, we would broadcast a document, a set of principles, a clear and public statement of how humanity would conduct itself in the galaxy from this point forward, outside the conclave's legal framework. Not a threat, not a declaration of war. A statement of rules, our rules for dealing with us. Oliver Graves, who had been quiet for most of this discussion, leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "You want to answer a resolution with a charter?" "I want to answer a resolution with a fact," I said. "The fact of what we are and what we're going to do, stated clearly, so there's no room for misunderstanding." Patricia Holden said, "What happens when species that aren't?" The conclave read it. I smiled. It was a real smile, not the diplomatic kind. That, I said, is exactly the point. Vote within that room of 13 was not unanimous. 2 people thought the risk was too high. 1 thought the timeline was impossible, but 10 people looked at the document I had shared on the secure screen, read through its 5 clauses, and said yes. Gregory Cole was the last to speak. He is not a dramatic man. He does not do things for effect. He read the document twice, closed the screen, and said, "Draft it. We vote on the full text in 48 hours. 48 hours. I left the call and sat alone in my office in the Seoul Diplomatic Corps building in Geneva. Outside the window it was nearly 10:00 in the morning, and the lake was silver and flat under a gray sky. Someone had left a cup of coffee on my desk that had gone cold. I picked it up anyway and drank it. I thought about what the arbiter Sin had said. The word ungovernable had appeared 3 times in the resolution's findings. I had noted it each time, the way you note a wound in a medical report, not with emotion, just with precision, because precision matters in emotion can wait for a private moment. Ungovernable from the conclave's perspective, that was a failing. For mine, sitting in that office with cold coffee and a document that was going to change something fundamental about humanity's place in the galaxy, it looked more like a description. We were not ungovernable. We governed ourselves constantly, endlessly, with the messy and imperfect, and sometimes brilliant machinery of democracy and argument and hard-won compromise. What we were not was governable by someone else's rules, according to someone else's assumptions, on someone else's timeline. The conclave had made the mistake of assuming those 2 things were the same. I opened the document and began the second draft. It took me 36 hours. I slept twice briefly on the small couch in my office. Nathan Adler brought me food at irregular intervals and made quiet, useful suggestions about phrasing that I incorporated into the 3rd and 4th drafts without comment, because Nathan has an ear for language that I deeply respect and occasionally envy. 2 lawyers from the diplomatic corps spent 18 hours checking every clause against every piece of conclave and interspecies law we had on record, looking for anything that could be used against us. Susan Park ran the economic projections 3 more times. Patricia Holden sent me a 1-line message at ZO 200 on the 2nd night that said the outer colonies will hold. Tell them that I did. At 2100 on the 2nd day, I sent the final text to Gregory Cole and the 12 others. At 2347 the vote came back 12 in favor, 1 abstention. The abstention was from a man named Arthur Dean, the director of the Colonial Administration's Legal Division, who told me privately that he thought every word of the document was correct, and he was abstaining purely because his legal instincts required him to formally note that we were entering unmapped territory, and he wanted that on record. I respected him enormously for that. At 800 on the 3rd day, I stood in front of the broadcast array in the Corps' main communication center. The array could reach every conclave relay and every independent receiver in charted space. It was not a subtle tool. When you used it, you were not sending a private message. You were talking to the galaxy. The communications technician, a young woman named Laura Finch, who had been working this console for 3 years and had the steady hands of someone who understood the weight of the equipment she operated, looked at me across the console and said, "Ready when you are, Ambassador." I looked at the document on the screen in front of me. 5 clauses, clean sentences, no diplomatic softening, no hedging language, no qualifications designed to leave room for misinterpretation, just what we meant, said plainly. "Ready," I said. Broadcast light came on. I began to read. My voice went out on every frequency the conclave used and several it did not. Laura Finch had made sure of that. The translation algorithms ran simultaneously in 430 languages, each one calibrated to the specific linguistic and cultural registers of its target civilization. so that the more heard it in formal, more diplomatic register, and the Kethvar heard it in the measured, evidence-based cadence that their culture used for serious statements, and the Erics heard it in a direct declarative structure that their language considered the highest form of address. Every species heard it in the way their own culture would say something it truly meant. I did not use the word exile in the broadcast. The conclave had used that word. It was their word for their decision. I had a different word for what was happening, and the word I used was independence. I said the Galactic Conclave has made a decision about humanity's place in the recognized community of interstellar civilizations. We have heard that decision. We are now making our own. Then I read the 5 clauses. I read them slowly. I did not perform them. I did not deliver them with the kind of theatrical weight that politicians sometimes use when they want a line to feel historic. I read them the way you read something you believe completely in, a voice that does not need volume to carry because the words themselves are doing the work. Clause 1. Any species that moves against a human vessel or human settlement without provocation will receive 1 warning, a single, direct, clearly communicated warning. After that warning, humanity will act to defend itself by whatever means the situation requires without further notice and without appeal to any external authority for permission. The warning will not be a suggestion. It will not be a negotiating position. It will be exactly what it says it is. I heard later that when this clause was received in the more dominions, government chambers, the defense minister, a 6-limbed creature called Breath, who had spent 40 years building the Moor's reputation as the most feared military power in the Eastern Spiral Arm, set down the translation document and did not speak for several minutes. His staff reported that his expression, which in Moor physiology was read through the positioning of his secondary limbs, indicated not anger, but something closer to recalibration. He was not reacting to a threat. He was updating a model. Clause 2. Any species that trades with humanity in good faith will receive humanity full protection on those trade routes, unconditionally. No conclave membership required, no political alignment required, no test, qualification, or ongoing performance review. You trade with us honestly. We keep your lane safe. The protection is not a product. It is not part of a negotiation. It is simply what we do. This clause, I was told, caused more immediate reaction than any of the others. Not because it was the most dramatic, it wasn't, but because it was the most specific. It was an offer, concrete, bounded, and real, and it was directed unmistakably at every small species that the conclave's economic structure had been quietly disadvantaging for decades. There were a lot of those species, more than the conclave's public face acknowledged. They had been listening to the broadcast from the moment it started, but when Clause 2 finished, they started listening differently. Clause 3. Any distress signal from any sentient species anywhere in known or charted space will be answered by the nearest human ship, regardless of political alignment, regardless of whether that species is a conclave member or not, regardless of whether that species has any relationship with humanity at all. If you are in distress and we receive your signal, we will come. We do not require permission. We do not require reciprocity. We do not require anything from you except the signal itself. I had spent more time on the wording of Clause 3 than on any other part of the document, not because it was complex, it was actually the simplest of the 5, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain it was not misread as strategy. It was not strategy, it was not a recruitment tool or a diplomatic maneuver or a way of building soft power with species who might otherwise stay neutral. It was just what we would do, stated plainly, because humans are the kind of species that answer distress calls, and it seemed important the galaxy to know that with certainty. Nathan Adler, who had been standing behind me in the communications center during the broadcast and was not usually a person given to visible emotion, pressed his lips together when I read Clause 3. He looked at the floor for a moment, then he looked back up and said nothing, which told me everything. Clause 4. We will not expand into any star system that contains existing sentient life without direct negotiation. With that life, we will not occupy, settle, or extract resources from inhabited systems without agreement. This is not a concession to the Conclave. This is our own standard, which we have applied consistently and will continue to apply regardless of external governance. What we will not accept is the Conclave's claim to authority over which uninhabited systems we may or may not settle. Empty space is not owned. We will go where we choose to go in space. That belongs to no one, and no external body has the standing to tell us otherwise. The Conclave's own legal framework, I had learned from those 18 hours of legal review, actually did not technically grant them authority over uninhabited systems. It had simply been assumed for so long that humanity would defer to their designations that no one had ever formally tested the point by stating it directly in the broadcast. I was not breaking any law. I was simply noting publicly and on the record that a certain assumption was not a fact. Clause 5 was the last. I took a breath before I read it. Clause 5. The Galactic Conclave's resolution of exile is acknowledged. We note its terms. We are reciprocating, effective immediately. Humanity considers itself as unbound by Conclave law, as the Conclave considers itself unbound by any obligation to humanity. We will operate outside their framework. We will create our own. Any species that wishes to engage with humanity will do so under the terms stated in this document, not under Conclave governance. We wish the Conclave's member species well. We do not wish to be their enemies, but we will not be their subjects, and we will not be their problem to manage. We are simply going to be what we are in the galaxy that we share, and we have now told you clearly what that looks like. You know where to find us. I looked up from the screen. The broadcast light was still on. I said, this transmission is made on behalf of the Emergency Compact of Sol, ratified by every recognized human government, and it represents the official position of Earth and all human territories. It is not a declaration of war, it is a declaration of ourselves. I nodded to Laura Finch. She cut the transmission. The communication center was very quiet. 3 technicians, Laura, Nathan, me, the equipment humming softly. Outside the windows, Geneva was going about its morning. People on the street below, walking with their coffee and their bags and their ordinary Tuesday concerns. Nathan said quietly, how long before they respond? The Conclave. I looked at the clock on the wall. 18 hours, maybe less. He nodded. And the others I thought about claws. 2. The small species, the ones who had voted gold not because they believed the resolution but because the conclave's economic weight had given them no real alternative, the ones who had been listening to the broadcast with a particular quality of attention sooner. I said I was right. The first message came in 4 hours and 17 minutes after the broadcast ended. It was a short communication transmitted on an unofficial frequency, formerly deniable. If the conclave ever asked about it, it came from a species called the Dravathi, who lived in a cluster of 3 systems, in a region the conclave had long designated as a resource management zone, which was a careful way of describing an arrangement that had for 60 years extracted the Dravathi's mineral wealth at below market rates and reinvested almost none of it in Dravathi infrastructure. The message said we heard Clause 2 we would like to discuss terms. I read it 3 times, then I drafted a reply that took me 4 minutes to write, available, named the time in the channel, come as you are. While I was writing that reply, 2 more messages arrived, both from small species, both referencing Clause 2. I sent them all the same response. Then I went back to the main screen and pulled up the conclave response tracking system, a tool we had built specifically to monitor their internal communications channels, about which I will say only that it was very good and had taken 3 years to develop. The conclave channels were not quiet, they were the opposite of quiet. In the 18 hours after the broadcast, message traffic between conclave member states increased by a factor of 11. There were emergency sessions being requested in 4 separate standing committees. There were private communications between the Velhari leadership and the M Dominion at a frequency that suggested genuine alarm, not managed reaction. I did not know yet what they were saying to each other. That would take another few days to piece together through the fragments our monitoring tools could access, but I could read the volume, and the volume said something very clear. They had expected defiance or submission. They had modeled for both. They had not modeled for this, and whatever this was, it was moving faster than their models had predicted. Yori of the KTHVAR sent me a personal message at 1700 that day. It came through an official diplomatic channel, which meant she wanted it on the record. It said, Ambassador OSI, I have read your document in full. I have also submitted a formal request to my government to begin the process of treaty negotiation with Earth. My government has asked me to tell you this directly rather than routing it through conclave channels. I think you understand why I did. 3 hours later, Gregory Cole called me. He had been watching the incoming messages accumulate in the compact's diplomatic queue. He did not say much. He was not a person who used words when silence would do. He said, how many? 11 so far, I said, from species currently inside the conclave. They're not making formal approaches yet. They're making contact, testing whether the channel is real. Is it? Every one of them will get a response within the hour. I said, yes, it's real. He made a sound that I had come to recognize over the years of working with him as Gregory Cole's version of satisfaction. It was not demonstrative. It was a small, quiet sound, like something settling into place. Good, he said, and then get some sleep, Yara. Tomorrow is going to be busy. It was the next morning. I had 37 messages waiting. By the end of the week it was 114. By the end of the month we had opened preliminary discussions with 22 species. Some of them were small, some of them were not. 2 of them had populations larger than Earth's. 1 of them controlled a trade corridor that the Conclave's eastern members depended on for 60% of their rare element imports. The Conclave noticed, of course they noticed. They sent a formal diplomatic note through the standard channel, the first direct communication they had sent humanity since the exile vote, stating that contacts between Conclave member species and exiled civilizations were subject to Conclave review and potential sanction. It was a carefully worded note. It was designed to sound authoritative without making any specific threat that could be formally challenged. I read it once. Then I filed it in a folder I had labeled with a naming convention that only I would understand and only I needed to expect it. I wrote back a single sentence: "We have received your note and recorded it." I did not say we would comply. I did not say we would not. I said we had received it. That was entirely true. It was also the most complete non-answer I had ever put in writing, and I was quietly proud of it. 6 weeks after the broadcast, our first bilateral trade agreement was finalized. It was with the Dravathi. The negotiation took 9 days, which by any standard was extraordinarily fast, but the Dravathi had been thinking about this for a long time. Their lead negotiator, a young male named Sarai, who had studied human trade law on his own time because he had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, came to the table with a clear sense of what they needed and a complete understanding of what they could offer in return. We reached terms on day 7 and spent 2 more days on legal review. I was present for the signing. Sarai sat across the table from me in a neutral facility on an independent station in a small room with no cameras because the Dravathi wanted the discretion, and he slid the document across the table and looked at me with the particular expression his species uses for a feeling that their language has a word for and ours does not, a word that translates most closely as the end of a very long wait. I signed it. He signed it, and then, because he was the one who had asked for this meeting 9 weeks ago with a 4-line message on an unofficial channel, and because I thought he had earned the right to hear it said plainly, I told him Clause 2 is active effective right. Now he looked at the document for a moment, then he looked at me. His feathers, the Dravathi also had feathers, a different structure from the Kthvars, flatter and more like a bird's, shifted slightly in color, moving toward a warm amber that I had learned from the cultural briefings I had read before. This negotiation was the Divath equivalent of a deep breath, the color of something finally fully believed. We know, he said. We have known since the broadcast. We have been watching your lanes. We have been watching what you do when no one formally asked you to do it. I raised an eyebrow, and he said, "Your ships have diverted twice in the past month to respond to emergency signals in that region, one from a mining platform that was not your mining platform, one from a small passenger vessel with engine failure. Both times you came, you helped, you left. No invoice, no political note, no follow-up communication requesting acknowledgement." He paused. "We have been watching to see if Clause 3 was a statement or a practice." "It is a practice." I did not say anything. I did Not need to, he slid a second document. Across the table, this is a request from my government, a formal request for an alliance, not just a trade agreement. Full terms to be negotiated at a pace that suits both parties. He held my eyes. We are not the only ones who will be sending this. He was right. 2 weeks later, the KTHVAR finalized their departure from the conclave. They did it formally through proper legal channels, citing a clause in the conclave's own charter that allowed for voluntary withdrawal. They had clearly been reading the charter carefully. Their public statement issued through the KTHVAR government's official communications bureau was 3 paragraphs long and said in its final line, "We have chosen to align ourselves with a civilization that demonstrates its values through action rather than resolution. We know what humanity will do because we have watched what humanity does. That is sufficient grounds for trust." I read that statement sitting at my desk in Geneva on a Tuesday evening, with the lake outside going dark and the lights of the city coming on across the water. I read it twice, then I sat with it for a while, not doing anything, just letting it settle. Nathan knocked on the open door of my office and came in. Without waiting for an answer, which was his habit, he sat down in the chair across from my desk and set a cup of hot coffee in front of me, which I had not asked for but genuinely needed. He said, "The conclave's Eastern Bloc has called a private session tomorrow. 3 of our monitoring tools picked up the scheduling request. What's the agenda? Not confirmed, but the traffic volume since the KTHVAR announcement suggests they're discussing the alliance request pattern. 17 species have now made formal or informal approaches out to us. That's a significant percentage of the conclave. Smaller membership." I nodded. I looked at the coffee. I looked out the window. I said they thought the exile would push us back to the table on their terms. They didn't model for the possibility that the exile would make us more attractive to species that were already looking for an alternative. Nathan was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The conclave has been the only table in the room for 4,000 years. People forget there might be other options until someone builds a different table." I looked at him. He shrugged. "That's all you're doing, really building a table?" "It's more than a table," I said. "I know." He said, "But it helps to remember it started as one." I thought about that for the rest of the evening. A table, a place where different parties could sit as equals, where the terms were clear and the rules were stated, and the power was not concentrated in the hands of the species that had been sitting at the head of the room longest. A place built not on the assumption that one civilization had the right to govern the rest, but on the simpler and more durable foundation of mutual interest and demonstrated behavior. The conclave had spent 4,000 years believing they were the table. They had exiled us because they thought we were too disruptive to sit at it. They had not considered the possibility that we would simply build our own. The next morning, I had 42 messages waiting. I made fresh coffee, sat down, and started answering them. 3 months after the broadcast, the incident in the Varath corridor happened, and for a brief, intense week, it looked like everything I had built might collapse under the weight of what I had promised. The freighter was called the Henley Cross, a mid-range cargo hauler registered out of the Brennan colony, running a supply run to one of the new outer settlements along the route we had established with the Dravathi, it was carrying basic supplies, agricultural equipment, medical consumables, structural materials, the ordinary cargo of keeping a small colony alive. Its crew was 9 people, all of them civilians, none of them armed beyond the standard emergency kit every deep space vessel carries. 3 Conclave enforcement vessels intercepted it in the Verath corridor at 1400 station time. The Ver corridor was technically an unmapped space, not Conclave territory, not human territory. A transit zone that had been used freely by multiple species for decades without formal governance, but the Conclave's enforcement vessels, all registered to the Soth Collective, had been positioning in that region for 2 weeks. I had been watching them through our monitoring systems and wondering. Now I knew the Soth vessels broadcast a quarantine order on Conclave authority frequencies, ordering the Henley Cross to stand down and prepare for boarding and seizure under the terms of the exile resolution. The Henley Cross's captain, a woman named Caroline Webb, who had been running supply routes for 15 years and had the calm, practical disposition of someone who has solved emergencies. She did not create, acknowledged the message and immediately broadcast distress call on every frequency she had. The distress call reached 2 of our patrol vessels before it reached the Soth. Our ships were faster, they always have been. Lieutenant Commander Patrick Slade was commanding the closer of the 2 vessels, a mid-range patrol ship. We had been running along the new Dravathi trade lanes for exactly this kind of situation. He was 29 years old and had come up through the Colonial Defense Force with a record that his senior officers described uniformly as deeply reliable. That is not always the first thing you want in an officer, but in that moment in that corridor with 3 armed Conclave enforcement vessels and 9 unarmed civilians and a trade agreement that was still less than 4 months old, deeply reliable was exactly right. He assessed the situation in the time it took his ship to close to communication range. He broadcast on the same Conclave authority frequency the Soth vessels had used calmly and clearly, and said, "This is the Colonial Patrol Vessel Arrow, responding to a distress call from the Henley Cross. The Henley Cross is operating under a legitimate transit agreement and is not in violation of any law that applies in unclaimed space. We are asking you to withdraw the quarantine order and allow the Henley Cross to proceed." The Soth vessels did not withdraw, they increased the distance between themselves and the Henley Cross in a pattern that Patrick, who had studied Soth military doctrine carefully, recognized as a prelude to an encirclement maneuver. He had 10 seconds to make a decision that would either confirm everything the Conclave had said about us in their resolution or prove something else entirely. He did not fire, he did not accelerate into a threatening posture. He matched the S vessel's movement, positioning his own ship and the second patrol vessel that had just arrived between the S ships and the Henley Cross, and broadcast again. You are now in a position where proceeding with your action will require moving through 2 Colonial Patrol vessels. We are not asking you to stand down because we are required to. We are asking you because doing this makes no sense for anyone in this corridor, and we would like everyone to go home intact. The Soth commander, whose name I would learn later was Vithon, held the standoff. For 42 minutes, I was on a secure call with Patrick for 30 of those minutes. listening, not speaking, because there was nothing I needed to say. He was doing exactly what the situation required in exactly the way it needed to be done, and any instruction from me would have been a distraction from his judgment, which was better than mine in that moment, because he was there and I was not. At 1537 the South vessels backed down. They did not broadcast an acknowledgement. They did not formally withdraw the quarantine order. They simply changed course and increased their distance from the Henley Cross until they were no longer a factor. It was the kind of retreat that tried very hard to look like a tactical repositioning, and it failed at that. But Patrick did not comment on it, and his ships did not follow them. The moment they were clear, he let them go. The Henley Cross continued on its route. Caroline Webb sent a message when she was through the corridor. All 9 crew accounted for, cargo intact, thank you. Patrick sent me a report at 1800. It was thorough and precise, and ended with a single observation offered in the same tone as the rest of the report. So, vessels were undamaged, their crews were not harmed. They know they backed down. They will either escalate through official channels or absorb the result. Our read is they absorb it. So, collective leadership is cautious, and the current political environment makes escalation against a human vessel that was doing nothing except protecting an unarmed freighter very hard to justify. Publicly he was right, they absorbed it, but the conclave did not absorb it. Quietly, 3 days later, a formal communication arrived through the standard diplomatic channel addressed to the Emergency Compact of Saul. It was written in the careful, layered language that the Velhari use for formal diplomatic censure, and it accused human patrol vessels of interfering with conclave authority enforcement operations and demanded an explanation. I wrote the response personally. It took me 2 hours, not because I was struggling to find the right words, but because I was being very precise about which words to use and which to leave out. I did not defend the patrol vessel's actions because I did not believe defense was the right frame. I explained them. I wrote 2 patrol vessels responded to a distress call from an unarmed civilian freighter operating in unclaimed space. They positioned themselves between the Henley Cross and 3 enforcement vessels that had issued a quarantine order on frequencies associated with conclave authority. They broadcast a request for de-escalation, which was eventually followed. No enforcement vessels were damaged, no crews were harmed. The Henley Cross completed its journey. The distress call was answered, and the situation resolved without injury to anyone. This is consistent with Clause 3 of the Human Addendum, which we transmitted to all receivers in charted space following the conclave's exile resolution. If there is a specific aspect of this sequence of events that requires further explanation, we are available. I sent it and waited. Conclave's response arrived 48 hours later. It was relative to the original censure, noticeably shorter. It acknowledged receipt of our explanation. It reiterated that conclave authority enforcement operations were governed by conclave law. It did not pursue the matter further. I filed it next to the previous communication in the folder I had labeled expected. What I had not expected, and this is looking back, one of the moments that showed me how much the addendum was reshaping the landscape in ways I was still learning to map, was the reaction from outside the conclave. The Dravathi news services covered the Varath corridor incident within hours of it happening. Their coverage was specific and factual. 2 human patrol vessels had responded to a distress call, positioned themselves to protect an unarmed freighter, requested de-escalation, and held their position until the enforcement vessels withdrew, without any exchange of fire and without any casualties. Sorry, our counterpart from the trade agreement sent me a message the next day. He said the Dravathi Council watched the full incident report. Clause 2, Clause 3. You did both at once without announcement. Our government's trust level just upgraded. The same pattern appeared across 6 other species that week. All of them had been following our activities. All of them had noted the incident. All of them sent some version of the same message. We watched what you did when it cost you something. We watched how you did. The response queue in the Compact's diplomatic office had been running at 30 to 40 messages per week since the broadcast. In the week after the Varath corridor incident, it hit 93. Patricia Holden called me on a Thursday morning and said, without preamble, our alliance request queue just passed 34 active files. I have 12 analysts and we need 20. When can we talk about staffing? Tomorrow morning. I said, good, she said. Also, the KEVAR ambassador is asking for a senior level meeting. I sorry specifically requested you. I sorry who had abstained, who had sent a private message the day of the vote that read in retrospect like the start of a much longer conversation. I met her 3 days later on the same neutral station where I had signed the Dravathi agreement. She came without a formal delegation, just herself and 1 assistant, which was either a statement of trust or a statement of practicality, and I decided it was probably both. She was older in person than the diplomatic feed suggested and smaller, and she moved with the particular stillness of a species that evolved in open sky. Very little wasted motion, every gesture considered. We sat across a table that was too large for 2 people and had clearly been designed for a much larger negotiation, and she looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. She said, I want to tell you why I abstained. I said I would like to hear it. She said every other vote in that chamber was a vote based on what the conclave's members feared about you. The Moor feared your expansion rate. The Soth feared your military capability. Valhari feared your unpredictability. The smaller species voted with the majority because they feared the consequences of being seen to oppose the majority. All of that fear is real. I am not saying your species has done nothing to earn concern, but I said, but fear, she said, is not the same as evidence of what a species will do. It is evidence of what other species imagine they will do. I had been watching you for 6 years. I had been watching how you behave when the stakes are not high enough for anyone to be watching carefully. The small things, the way your freight captains negotiate, the way your diplomatic staff handle disagreements. They could easily win by force but choose not to. The way your patrol vessels operate in buffer zones. Cautious, not aggressive, always leaving the other party a way to back down. That does not require visible surrender. She paused. I abstained because the resolution was based on fear, and I do not believe fear is sufficient grounds for a governing decision of that magnitude. I did not vote against because 17 species were prepared to walk out of the conclave entirely if the resolution failed, and the destabilization that would cause was not a risk I was willing to accept for my piddle. I said that was a very precise calculation. Yes, she said, I am a precise person. The amber gray of her feathers shifted slightly. As are you. We talked for 4 hours. By the end of it, we had the framework for a full treaty. Not just a trade agreement, defense provisions, communication access, mutual scientific research, a joint advisory council, the most comprehensive agreement humanity had signed with any species since our first contact 40 years ago. Before she left, she said one more thing. She said the conclave will eventually request a summit. They are already in internal discussion about it. When they do, they will frame it as offering you readmission on modified terms they will not understand initially, that you have moved past the point where readmission is what you want. What do you think we want? I said. She considered the question as if it were entirely genuine, which it was. I think she said that you want the same thing you have always wanted, a seat at a table where the rules are fair. You have spent 40 years trying to get that seat within the conclave. Now you are building the table. Nathan had said almost exactly the same thing weeks ago. I made a note to tell him because he would appreciate it when the conclave requests the summit. Yori said, I would like to be at that table. You will be, I said. She nodded once, picked up her folder and left. I sat in the empty room for a few minutes after she was gone, looking at the 2 large table and the 2 chairs we had used. Through the room's single viewport, a strip of deep space was visible, black and star scattered and entirely indifferent to everything happening in the small pressurized volume where 2 species were deciding what the future looked like. I thought about the Varith corridor. I thought about Caroline Webb and her 9 crew members and the message she had sent. All 9 crew accounted for, cargo intact, thank you. The simple, direct language of someone who had been in danger and was no longer in danger and wanted the people who had helped to know it. I thought about Soar's feathers turning amber, the color of something finally fully believed. I thought about what we were doing, not in the grand political sense that the briefings and the reports and the diplomatic notes captured, but in the immediate human sense of what was actually happening day by day. We were answering messages, we were signing agreements, we were sending ships when signals came in, we were showing up in the Varith corridor and in the Dravoth trade lanes and in 34 diplomatic queues. And we were doing what the addendum said we would do because we had said we would do it, and we were the kind of species that did what we said. It was not complicated. It had never been complicated. The conclave had spent 4,000 years making it complicated, layering governance and authority and enforcement structures over what was at its core a very simple question: what kind of civilization do you want to be? And are you actually being it? We were being it, not perfectly, not without difficulty, not without the mistakes and arguments and hard calls that come with any real enterprise, but consistently, recognizably, in the way that mattered. I picked up my folder and stood up. There were 42 messages waiting. Cathar Treaty needed a second draft. Review, Patricia Holden needed 20 analysts, and I was going to find her at least 15 of them. The conclave was going to request a summit, and when they did, I needed to be ready to tell them not what we wanted back, but what we were Offering forward, I had work to do. I turned off the light in the empty room and went to do it, the conclave summit. Request arrived on a Tuesday morning, 9 months after II had told me to expect. It was formatted with the full ceremonial weight of Valhari diplomatic tradition, gold-embossed header in 4 languages, the arbiter's personal seal, a list of proposed attendees that ran to 2 pages. I read it with my coffee at 7 Hunter Road, standing at the window of my Geneva office where the lake was, doing what it always did in autumn, which was to go a deep and serious gray that I found, for reasons I had never fully examined, easier to think beside than the bright blues of summer. The proposed summit had one agenda item: reintegration framework discussion, humanity and the galactic conclave. The proposed attendees were the orbiter, Sphæron, and senior representatives of the original 412 member species. There was a note at the bottom in smaller script that the conclave was prepared to offer modified observer status pending formal review period and commitment to conclave governance standards. I set the coffee down. I read it again. I read it a third time to make sure I was not misreading the specific phrase modified observer status, because I wanted to be absolutely precise about what I was seeing before I responded to it. I was not misreading it. Modified observer status, the same category we had held before the exile vote, the category that had given us no delegate pod, no voting crystal, no formal standing in resolutions that directly affected our own civilization, the category they were offering us back as though it were a gift. I sat down at my desk. I thought about the 34 species that now had active agreement files with us. I thought about Isari and Sorai and Patricia Holden and Oliver Graves and Susan Park and Nathan and Caroline Webb and Patrick Slade. I thought about 93 messages in a week and the 2 large table on the neutral station and feathers turning amber. I thought about 9 months of work, of showing up, of doing what we said we would do in the corridors and trade lanes and distress frequencies of a galaxy that was slowly, carefully beginning to recalibrate its understanding of what humanity was. I thought about modified observer status. Then I called Gregory Cole. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he had already seen the message. He said, "I read it, modified observer status." I said, "A pause. They think we've been waiting for read mission." I said, "They think that's what the last 9 months were waiting." "I know," he said. "What do you want to do?" "I want to accept the summit," I said, on different terms. There was a long pause. In the silence I could hear the particular quality of Gregory Cole thinking, not hesitation, not doubt, just the specific interval of a precise mind making sure of its ground before it speaks. Then he said, "Tell me the terms." I told him. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "How long to draft the formal response?" 2 hours, I said. "Send it to me before you transmit." I spent those 2 hours on a document that needed to say exactly the right thing in exactly the right way, not aggressive, not triumphant, not the language of a civilization that had won a confrontation and wanted the other party to know it, the language of a civilization that had changed the situation and wanted the other party to understand it clearly without confusion or false hope. The response said, "The emergency compact of Saul acknowledges the Galactic Conclave's request for a summit and accepts the invitation. We proposed the following modifications to the summit structure. First, the agenda. Items should be restated as framework for a new relationship between the Galactic Conclave and the Human Alliance. We're not seeking reintegration, we are proposing a new structure. Second, the attendees should include full delegations from all species currently in bilateral agreement with humanity. 34. As of this communication, with additional agreements in progress, these species are parties to any framework that affects their relationships with us and with the Conclave. Their present is not optional. Third, the location should be a neutral station jointly designated by both parties, not a Conclave facility. Fourth, seating at the summit table should be equal for all parties. There is no observer category in this proposal. Everyone at this summit sits at the table. I read it back to myself. Then I sent it to Gregory Cole. He read it and sent back 2 words, send it. I did. The Conclave's response took 6 days, which was faster than I expected. It was shorter than their original communication and contained none of the ceremonial weight of the first message. It acknowledged our proposed modifications. It accepted the neutral station. It accepted the open agenda. It did not in its text formally accept the seating arrangement, but it did not formally reject it either, and in the language of Valhari diplomatic communication, a non-rejection is an acceptance with room for the accepting party to claim they had not accepted until circumstances required them to. They were learning, or they were beginning to. The neutral station was a facility in the Cathar home system which Isari had offered and which I had accepted without hesitation, because having the summit in a system controlled by a species that had formally allied with us sent a message that needed no words. Isari managed the facility arrangements with the precise efficiency I had come to expect from her. And when I arrived 3 weeks later, the meeting room was not the too large room I had imagined, but a carefully calibrated space that fit 37 delegations, 34 allied species plus ours, plus the Conclave senior representatives at a single continuous table, oval in shape, with no head and no foot. I arrived 2 hours before the session began and walked the room once slowly. Nathan walked it with me. He did not say anything. I did not say anything. We were both looking at the same thing, and neither of us needed to describe it. Table without a head, 37 chairs of the same design, the Conclave's delegation chairs and ours and the Dravathes and the Cathars and the 31 others, all identical, all equally placed, all carrying the same implicit statement about what kind of conversation this was. So I arrived early with the Dravathi delegation and spent a few minutes talking to the KTHVAR assistant, who was managing the room's translation array. He caught my eye across the table and gave a small nod. I nodded back. Patricia Holden arrived with the Compact's economic team and immediately went into a quiet, focused conversation with Oliver Graves in the far corner, both of them reviewing something on a shared screen, both of them with the concentrated expressions of people who had been preparing for this for a very long time and were making sure they had not missed anything. The Conclave's delegation arrived exactly on time. Sutherin led them, walking with the measured pace of a very old being who has learned to make slowness look like dignity. He was flanked by 2 senior representatives from the M Dominion and a Velhari legal advisor I recognized. From the exile session, they entered the room, and in the moment when every new arrival to a meeting room reflexively looks for their designated position. Paused, they were looking for the head of the table, the seat of authority, the place that in every conclave session in 4,000 years of governance had been occupied by the arbiter. There was no such seat. There was only the oval and 37 identical chairs. Sutherin's pause lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then he walked to the nearest open chair and sat down. His legal advisor sat beside him. The Mo representatives took the seats on his other side. They settled unhurried, as though this was entirely expected, and if any of them felt the significance of the moment, it did not show in the parts of their physiology that were visible to me. I sat down in the chair that was 2 positions to Sutherin's left because it was close to the center of one long side of the oval and had a clear sightline to most of the room. Nathan sat beside me. Patricia Holden took the seat on my other side. Isori sat directly across the table. The room filled, 37 delegations finding their places, the translation array warming up, the quiet sounds of a diplomatic session organizing itself, papers, screens, the soft clearing of various kinds of throats and vocal equivalents. When everyone was settled, Sodden looked across the table. His 4 hands were folded in front of him. He looked older in this room than he had in the conclave chamber 9 months ago. I do not think it was the lighting, he said. Ambassador OC, you proposed a new structure. We are here. Tell us what you have in mind. The room was completely still. I looked at the folder in front of me, not the addendum. That document had done its work already. This was something new. I had spent 7 months drafting it with 34 co-authors in all of their languages, calibrated to all of their legal and diplomatic frameworks, balanced between human directness and the various forms of careful expression that different species used when they meant something with their whole civilization. It was a proposed amendment to the conclave's founding charter, not a challenge to the conclave as existence. The conclave was a real institution with real infrastructure, and 4,000 years of function, and dismantling it would cause more harm than any disagreement about governance philosophy was worth. It was a proposal to change the charter's foundational premise from a document that established one governing body with authority over recognized civilizations to a document that established a framework for cooperation between civilizations of equal standing with no permanent authority held by any single species or institution. It had 34 co-signatories. I opened the folder and set it on the table. The translation array picked up the document and processed it for every delegation. Simultaneously, the rustling of 37 sets of attention focusing on 37 screens filled the room. For a moment, I said, "We are not here to negotiate read mission. We are here because 34 species and humanity have decided that the current structure of galactic governance does not reflect the reality of a civilized galaxy, and we have a specific proposal for changing it. We did not come here to take anything from the conclave. We came here to offer something. Read it and then let's talk." The room was quiet, reading quiet, the specific quality of silence that happens when many minds are absorbing something at the same time. I looked at Surin. He was reading. His pale eyes moved across The screen at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, the pace of careful comprehension. His four hands remained folded. I could not read whatever was happening behind his face, and I had known him long enough to know that this was always true. The Velhari are not an unreadable species, but Sverren specifically had spent 4,000 years in governance and had mastered the art of processing information in the presence of other parties without telegraphing his reaction. Then something shifted in his expression, not a large shift, not anything that would have been perceptible to someone who had not spent 6 years watching him. It was a small change in the set of the muscles around his eyes, a change I had seen before in only one context. Not agreement, not concession, but the particular expression of a person who has understood something they had not expected to understand. He looked up from the screen. He looked at me. He looked at the 34 delegations arranged around the oval table, all of them present because they had chosen to be, because they had read Clause 2 and Clause 3 and watched what we did in the Varith corridor and decided that we were something worth joining. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You have been working on this for some time." 9 months, I said, and longer. Some ways the 34 species. He looked around the table again slowly, taking in each delegation. When we passed the resolution, we had reports indicating that you had approximately 7 bilateral contacts with minor conclave members. We did not anticipate this number. No, I said, you didn't. Another pause. We expected you to petition for readmission. I know, I said. Southern looked at the document on his screen again. Then he looked at the MU representative beside him. A brief, unreadable exchange, and then back at me. You are asking the conclave to restructure its foundational governance at the request of a civilization we exiled 9 months ago. I am asking the conclave to restructure its foundational governance at the request of 35 civilizations. As I said, 34 of whom are currently your members, whose signatures are on this document and who are making this request through proper diplomatic channels. The fact that one of those 35 civilizations is one you exiled is worth discussing, yes, but that discussion is secondary to the substance of the proposal. The MU representative made a sound that translated through my earpiece as something that hovered between acknowledgement and concession. It was a sound I had never heard a more representative make in a diplomatic session before. I made a note of it. Southern was quiet for a long time. The room let him be quiet. Everyone in the room understood, I think, that something was being decided in that silence, not the proposal itself, which would take months of negotiation to process and years to implement, but something more immediate, something about the shape of this conversation and what it meant for the shape of every conversation that followed. He said, we will need to review the amendment in full committee. Of course, I said, we have time. There will be objections from several member states. I expect so. I said, we will address them. That is what this process is for. He looked at me. You are very calm. I have been working toward this conversation for a long time. I said, I am glad to be in it. Another silence. Then, for the first time in 6 years, in every session, every encounter, every carefully managed exchange in the conclave's great chamber, Southern, the Velhari, arbiter of the galactic conclave, did something I had never seen him do in a formal diplomatic setting. He smiled. It was a small expression, barely a change in the geometry of his ancient face, but it was real, and it was directed at me, and it carried in it something I could only interpret as recognition, the feeling of two very different kinds of mind arriving from opposite directions at the same place at the same time. He said, then looked around the table. 34 species, all of them here by choice. Nathan beside me, quiet and steady. I saw her across the table, with her flat, serious gray feathers and her 3 years of patient watching, finally arriving at its purpose. Sorry, with his amber warmth, Patricia Holden and Oliver Graves with their screens full of economic projections, and their 20 analysts back in Geneva doing the work, the more representatives who had voted gold 9 months ago and were now sitting at a table that had no head, processing the possibility that the galaxy had changed while they were not looking. I opened the second folder, the one with the detailed proposal for the amendment process, the negotiation schedule, the timeline, the mechanisms for bringing the full conclave membership into the discussion, months of work ahead, years probably. Nothing in governance happens fast when you are doing it carefully and honestly, and with the full weight of the civilizations involved. Every clause of the amendment would be argued, every line would be reviewed. There would be sessions that ended without agreement and sessions that required patience I was not sure I had, and sessions where the gap between what we wanted and what the conclave could offer would seem too large to cross. But we were here, 35 civilizations at a table with no head, talking to each other as equals in a room that had been set up by a species that had come out of an abstention to sign a treaty in a system where 9 months ago there had been no human presence at all. We had started with 4 words and a door swinging shut. We had walked through months of work and distress calls and corridor standoffs and trade agreements and coffee going cold on desks in Geneva while documents got their 3rd and 4th drafts. We had built a table, and now we were all sitting at it. I looked at the proposal in front of me. I looked at Surin, who was waiting, and at the 34 allies who had trusted us with their names on a document that was going to change something fundamental, and at Nathan, who had brought me coffee and made the word table do more work than it had any right to, and I felt the specific quiet, undramatic feeling of something that had been a long time coming finally arriving. I said, let's start with Article 1, and we did.